Hi, my name is Khalil Cumberbatch, and I'm the Associate Vice President of Policy at the David Rothenberg Center for Public Policy at the Fortune Society, and welcome to Both Sides of the Bars, a discussion-driven show that examines the criminal justice system from various perspectives, including those most impacted by the criminal justice system. We discuss critical questions about how the current system works, its intersections with social justice, and highlight the efforts that are being made to improve the lives of everyone that is affected by it. We ask you, the viewers, to spread the word about both sides of the bars and share your comments with us on Twitter at TheFortuneSOC and at Cumberbatch. Today's show is titled Incarceration Nations, an international look at incarceration. My guest today is Dr. Boz Dreisinger, professor at John Jay College for Criminal Justice, founder of the Prison to College Pipeline, and author of Incarceration Nations. Boz has traveled the world examining the imprisonment system of other nations and how the U.S. model has influenced those systems. Boz, thank you for joining us today.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah. So I would love for us to start the conversation nationally and talk about this notion of mass incarceration as we see it as a country. And then I would love for us to talk about how other countries view our imprisonment model and how that model has impacted those countries themselves.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So when you, in your work in writing Incarceration Nations, in working in state prisons, in teaching at a very prominent college, what would you say is your interpretation of the term mass incarceration? And what are some of the nuances that our viewers should be aware of when they do hear that term?
So I think mass incarceration captures the way that the carceral state or incarceration, prison stuff, the criminal justice system has wormed its way into so many facets of life and impacted so many people in one way or another. And that's what I think that term mass captures, that it's not only about the obscene numbers of people who are incarcerated, but all the web of people who are impacted. And that means families, wives, children, communities, thinking about this as an epidemic, as a kind of disease that has spread all over and has its tentacles everywhere. And I think that's what that term most suggests to me.
And so in writing your book, Incarceration Nations, talk to our viewers about, one, the premise of the book, but then also why you travel the world looking at other nations and their imprisonment systems.
Yeah, so by way of background, I mean, I come to this work primarily as an educator. I got involved in, I founded the Prison to College Pipeline program at John Jay, started volunteering in prisons.
To College
yeah,
Pipeline?
So I started volunteering in prisons about 16 years ago, just because I was getting letters from people in prison who had read my articles and seen some of the films that I'd been involved with, and which led to my officializing that through John Jay and starting the Prison to College Pipeline. And in a nutshell, the Prison to College Pipeline is a college program in prison that also has a large reentry component. So it's about making education the centerpiece of a person's time in prison, but also a person's time upon release, and taking advantage of college and the college community, both while someone is incarcerated and also when someone is coming home and starting again and building a life and creating community. And so I've been, I started planning the program about a decade ago, and have been knee-deep in it ever since. And I think the idea for the book kind of came to me fairly early on in that process, because I think we started to see a shift in the discourse in this country around mass incarceration. And I feel like, and I know people who've been at this far longer than I have, present company included, who can speak to the fact that for many years it was so unpopular, and no one wanted to talk about prisons, and no one wanted to fund programs and so on. And then due to a whole host of things that started happening, including films like 13th and books like The New Jim Crow, it became a much more mainstream topic, and which is kind of where we're at today, which is not to say there isn't loads of work to do anyway, but it's present in the discourse. But the thing that I noticed was that, number one, in an international context, and I've always been a traveler. I've done a lot of writing about culture and arts internationally, especially in the Caribbean. And it was a total wasteland as far as the discourse around prisons. No one wanted to talk about it whatsoever. It was reminiscent of what it felt like when I first started getting engaged with this work. And the other thing is that I felt like there was still too much of a economic bent to the discussion about ending mass incarceration because it's cheaper. And it was always these equations that were put forth. And I felt like we really need to talk about this from a philosophical perspective and step back and say, what are we doing when we warehouse human beings? And what is the impact of that? And why do we imagine that this will make us safer? And so I wanted to do those things together, and which led to my starting the journey that led to Incarceration Nations.
And so talk to our viewers about some of the countries that you visited, and some of the work that you've done with some of those government officials, right? Folks who are who have access to some of the highest offices in some of the countries that you visited. So talk to our viewers about that.
So I chose countries kind of based on, I wanted some kind of geographic diversity to try to hit as many continents as I could. And each country kind of focuses, each country is a chapter that focuses on a particular issue that resonates in that country in particular. So I went to 9 countries. I started in Rwanda, I ended in Norway. It was Rwanda, South Africa, Uganda, Jamaica, Brazil, Australia, Singapore, Thailand, and Norway. And for instance, the Thailand chapter focuses on women. Southeast Asia has a very disproportionately high number of women who are incarcerated on, particularly as foot soldiers in the drug industry, and therefore become victims of the war on drugs in a very profound way. I looked at solitary confinement in Brazil. I looked at the private prison industry in Australia. And I think the kind of undercurrent of the book is the idea that America has foisted this very ugly, very bereft, very morally, economically, philosophically bankrupt system on the world. And to me, that was actually a great revelation. I think I didn't realize the extent to which the copycatting has happened both historically, like starting in the 19th century with the birth of the modern prison system, up to this day. And so when we talk about issues in this country that are very live issues in this debate around solitary confinement, around privatization and prisons, around the war on drugs, all of these are things that the American system created and then exported via globalization, originally through colonialism and then through globalization. And so it's actually a really frightening thing to go around the world and see this like cut and paste version of justice, right? Because you think about the incredible diversity of our world and the people in it and the communities in it and how they think about justice and community and peace and safety. And the idea that there's this one very stupid, for lack of a better term, cut and paste model, right down to the physical architecture of these prisons. I mean, I was in this year alone, I was in South Africa for 3 months, I was in Chile and Brazil, and in all of those countries I went to prisons that look like Eastern State Penitentiary in Pennsylvania, which was one of the first 2, is considered the first 2 modern prisons. Eastern is copied in over 300 instances all over the world. Wow. So it's like a physical manifestation of the way this ideology has been cut and pasted. And so part of what that led me to, you were mentioning governments, is that it led me to, when I was writing the book, I didn't want to just go in. I'm not a a passive researcher. I'm someone who likes to engage, and I love teaching, and I love building with people and being in classrooms. And so in every context, when I would go to a country, I would try to do something, be involved with a program. And for the most part, I was working with NGOs. Some countries like Singapore, you can't get in without the government, so I would engage with the government. But for the most part, I went in with NGOs, and I would teach or participate in a workshop program, anything that let me just engage and not be, standing on the sidelines. And so that led to a lot of conversations with organizations and coalition building with both grassroots organizations and also eventually to conversations with governments about how can we build together and how can we think about solutions and improvements and both small scale and larger scale. And that's where I am today with the work, and that the next step was the development of the Incarceration Nations network, which is I guess the motto is correcting and connecting, because I really like the term corrections, and it's allegedly what we're supposed to be doing, right? And corrections also doesn't just mean correcting the flawed people inside. It means correcting the issues that cause incarceration in the first place, that impoverish communities, all the systems of racism and economic inequality that produce prisons and funnel people into them. So, and then connecting, because this idea that we shouldn't be doing this work in silos, and that is true on both a local level and on an international level, that we can have this conversation in a global context. And there are so many things that are gained when we put our collective heads together as a global community, addressing a crisis that was born essentially because of one country, us, and think creatively about solutions and how we can address this.
And so say a little bit more about the vision for the network, what kind of platform it will serve, and its ultimate intended purpose.
So it's very much about building connections between organizations, so getting all on the same page.
International
organizations who are engaged in this work from different angles. So the first major project that I'm engaging in, and really it's the organization is about kind of pulling together under one heading a lot of the work that I've just been doing in terms of building partnerships globally up till now, that the book led to. I mean, when the book came out, it led to my doing a lot of talks, both nationally and internationally, and creating even more networks and building the connections with all of these wonderful people that are trying to impact change globally. And I said, well, let me put this under one umbrella and figure out what the mission should be. And so the first major project that I'm working on is a multimedia platform, web platform for organizations doing, for lack of a better term, prison reform work, or as I prefer to say, prison reimagining work, and who are thinking innovatively around criminal justice reform in all over the world. And so so as part of that, there'll be just a big database, and you'll be able to click on various countries, and you can click on Kenya, and you can click on Cambodia, and you can find out who's doing the work there. And that is a very simple thing, but it's enormous. There's no such thing that exists like that. And really, it's been amazing to me as I travel the world in this globalized world that we live in, where you think it's not that hard to find out what's happening over there, but it is. And what it will be to have all these organizations on the same page, literally, is very powerful. And then of those, we've selected in consultation with all of the justice consultants that are part of Incarceration Nations network, 70 organizations that we'll look a little more closely at, and I'll personally visit some of them, do some filmed interviews with clients who can speak to how this organization impacted them, the good work that it did, and we'll kind of feature those on the website, and you'll be able to watch some videos and understand a little bit more about how these organizations envision the problem and envision the solution. And ultimately, that's about kind of demonstrating how similar a lot of those problems are. I mean, reentry, for instance, is a crisis all over the world. I've never been in a country where that wasn't at the top of the list of there are no services, there are no resources for people coming home from prison. And of course, we know what that means, right? It creates this revolving door scenario. So the crisis of women and incarceration globally, the narrative is almost identical from one country to the next. And so I think it's powerful to see that. And then powerful to think about what are the innovative solutions that are happening. So that's the first major project, but it's also, I'm also very interested in bringing a lot of different people to the table to change the narrative and change the conversation. And so how do you do that? Well, it can't just be us preaching to the choir, and it can't just be academics talking to each other. It has to be what happened, in a sense, what happened in the US, where a lot of people came to the table and are still coming to the table from all walks of life, whether it's people like you and me who are engaged in doing the work, and professors, academics, but celebrities, influencers, people who can, artists, people who can speak to this. So I've already been doing a lot of worldwide events, awareness raising events with individuals who are directly impacted at the forefront of that. There isn't really a platform. I think obviously in this country there's been a great shift in the movement in thanks to the work of people like you who've put directly impacted people at the forefront and not just as being one little token at the table. Internationally that doesn't exist, and it's still work that is unfortunately being done by people outside that space. But when they have a platform to engage in the work, to do the work, it's a really exciting thing. So we do film screenings. When the platform is done, we're gonna have two big events, high profile events, one in New York and one in Johannesburg, South Africa, with directly impacted people there, speaking, engaging, celebrities and influencers there who can bring this to a mainstream audience, but turn the needle in terms of who's thinking about this and who's talking about this in big ways.
Yeah. So how does prison to college pipeline and the linkage to education, as you mentioned, as a centerpiece, how does that intersect, and how is that involved in the work of the network?
So yeah, I'm glad you asked that, because that is another big component of the work. I, of course, am deeply invested in education and love teaching more than, I wear a lot of hats, and I always say my favorite place to be anytime, anywhere is in the classroom with students, whether incarcerated students, non-incarcerated, whatever. But in doing this work internationally, I've had the chance to engage with a number of universities and departments of corrections in various countries who are interested in building prison to college pipelines. And I use that term not as again, it's not a cut and paste model that I can here take this and then superimpose it on your country, but rather it's kind of a philosophy that is guided by two, what I see as basic premises. One is that universities have a role to play in creating safer communities and building safer, more just worlds. And two, the idea of the pipeline piece, which is that any work that begins inside must continue on the outside. And I think I see a lot of that lacking. Especially internationally, that all these organizations will run to do some program inside prison, but they're not available for that person when that person comes home from prison. And that's a problem. And so in some capacity, any education program that begins on the inside must continue on the outside, however that looks. So those are the two broad components of it. And then within that, the hope is to collaborate with institutions and with governments to build versions of the prison to college pipeline. And so the countries that I've been engaging with are countries that I know best, that I've spent the most time in and have built the strongest relationships in. And so that's Jamaica, Trinidad, South Africa, and Brazil. And in each of those countries, it's not it's not my program, it's their program that I come in to build with them on, and our students come in. Devon Simmons, who's the first graduate of the Prison to College pipeline here in the US, and a very, very wise individual, has come with me both to South Africa, went to Jamaica to build with the university and the government there around what their version of a prison to college pipeline will look like. And actually we launched in South Africa on Mandela Day in July, which was incredible, very stunningly moving.
And you launched another chapter of Prison to College Pipeline.
We launched, it's with Stellenbosch University, which is a university about an hour outside of Cape Town, and they're currently working in a prison. They've started on a very kind of small scale, skeletal basis, but it's there. And what they've called it is the Ubuntu Learning Community. And Ubuntu is it's a Bantu term for I am you and you are me. It's this idea, in many ways it's like the foundation of restorative justice, this idea that we are connected. And so they named the program that, and they've been going now for a couple of months, but we had an official launch date on the 18th, and Devon spoke and the students spoke. It was really, really moving.
Yeah. And so how many students have completed the Prison to College pipeline here in the US? And what are some of the other countries that you're looking to replicate something like the Prison to College pipeline?
So the number, it depends how we define complete the program. We've had almost a dozen graduates, both associates and bachelor's degrees, but we have, I lose track because thankfully we have students coming home every day, it feels like, or every month. But we have at least about 75 students who've come home. About 2/3 of them are in school or have completed school. We're in touch with almost all of them who are kind of part of our community. We call ourselves a family, and so we have get-togethers. We have a holiday party every year, and we define success it's not just about did you get the degree, but are you in a good place? And of course we don't only define it as did you go back to prison. You know, we set the bar higher than that. And are you satisfied? Are you in a happy place? And so that looks differently for everyone. For some it looks like getting the bachelor's degree, going on for a master's. I have a student applying to law school currently who graduated from John Jay. But for others it looks like I'm working a solid job. I had 2 children. I'm in a healthy relationship. I come to the holiday party every year, and that's beautiful. And then they'll shoot me a text and be like, hey Boz, what's up? Miss you, love you. Like, that's success. And now we have inside, we've got 50 students at Otisville Correctional Facility, which is upstate. And we've now have a hub right here in the city at Queensborough Correctional Facility, which we're really excited about because obviously with the proximity, it's a lot easier to build it out. And we hope to grow our numbers and do all kinds of innovative things over there.
So I would love for you to talk very briefly about what you see in terms of the future of mass incarceration, not only in this country, but also what could we achieve here that, as you mentioned, right, what we implement here is replicated in other countries. And so I would just love for you to talk very briefly about that, about what you envision is possible around the issue called mass incarceration.
So I'm an optimist. I am by nature, but I also cultivate optimism because I think to do this work, you really have to, you have to do it with joy, you have to do it with optimism, you have to do it with love, and really push the boundaries of what's possible. And I think what I get excited about is anything that's breaking down the wall. Whatever that means, So when I think about, for instance, my book ends in Norway. I went to the famous open prisons of Norway. And in Scandinavia, that is a tradition of, and it's not every prison in Scandinavia is open, but
and by open you mean
open
no wall,
means so it might have some kind of a wall, but it's not really going to have a barbed wire, forbidding, evil-looking wall. But most importantly, it means that it's a porous entity. People can leave, go to work, come back, go to family leave, come back. They remain connected to their communities even during their incarceration. And I think when I think about progressive open prisons, that can look different kinds of ways. That's as close as it gets to me for like the oxymoronic term progressive prison. Those kinds of open prisons are the models that I envision as, because, and then when the people are, you know, confined, when they don't have their liberty overnight or whatever it is, they're engaged in genuine positive work. While remaining connected to their community, while remaining connected to their families. And so when I think about the push, both here and internationally, I think about open prisons. And I think about, of course, I think about decarceration, all of the policy shifts that have to happen. I mean, the war on drugs, are dealing with violence in our communities, restorative justice proceedings. How can we literally create a case-by-case scenario where incidents are addressed through the context of restorative justice? But, and I think about any space of confinement involving that kind of porous relationship. And I think, actually, I'll tell you a funny story, because the Norwegian prison that I visited, it's called Bastøy Island. It's quite famous. It's in Michael Moore's documentary. It's, I mean, it's a gorgeous island in Norway. It's run like an eco camp. And it's a really remarkable place, and the individuals who are incarcerated there leave the island in the day, and they wear regular clothing. I mean, it's as humane as I've ever seen something called a prison to be. And the warden there is a very progressive guy. We've talked a long time about, and we've always stayed in touch. And the other day I was researching open prisons and thinking about, because I'm going to visit a few of them as part of this project and look at some new models and how that's progressing. And I noticed that there was one in the Czech Republic, right, just outside of Prague, that an open, and that's a pretty big deal in an Eastern European context. And so I got really excited, and then next thing I know, I'm on Facebook, and I see Tom, the warden in the Norwegian prison. He's visiting that, and his caption was, "Oh, it's good to see that our work has started here." So what moved me about that was, finally someone is exporting that is not the U.S.
Oh, got it.
You know, it's the Norwegian model that people are going after now, as opposed to our model, which doesn't work, which is, you know, bankrupt in every way.
Yeah. Well, Boz, thank you. The time has flown by. How can our viewers learn more about you, learn more about your work, learn more about the network, and how could they be helpful?
Well, I'm on, I think my Twitter is on there. It's at Boz Dreisinger, and my Instagram, incarcerationnationsnetwork.com is the website to learn more about the organization, and my email is super easy to find if you Google me.
Awesome, awesome. Well, thank you, Boz. And thank you for sharing your wealth of experience, your funny stories, and your analysis with our viewers. Thank you so much.
My pleasure.
And thank you to the viewers for tuning in. If you're interested in finding out more about the Fortune Society, please check us out on the web at www.fortunesociety.org or on Facebook by typing in thefortunesociety.com. This is Khalil Cumberbatch, and I appreciate you joining us as we critically look at both sides of the bars.